Good evening. I'm Chip O'Brien, president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and I want to welcome you to our special national live stream presentation. This special presentation is hosted in partnership with Wunderbar Together and the World Affairs Councils of America as part of their nationwide Engage America series, focusing on what 30 years of a reunited Germany means for transatlantic relations and the world. Wunderbar Together USA is a comprehensive and collaborative initiative funded by the German Federal Foreign Office and implemented by the Goethe Institute, and is dedicated to broadening and deepening public understanding of Germany and the US-German relationship. We'd also like to thank our Savannah-based members and sponsors for their continued support during these unprecedented times, as well as welcome our many local guests and those from councils around the nation. The Savannah Council on World Affairs was founded 36 years ago as an all-volunteer, nonpartisan, member-driven affiliate of the World Affairs Councils of America. And our mission has not changed. It includes to foster individual awareness of, broaden community interest in, and promote the study of international issues, and to work with other organizations concerned with similar objectives. In so doing, we offer speaker programs monthly on a wide variety of critical international topics. We provide scholarships for Savannah State and Georgia Southern University students to study abroad. We participate in outreach programs with local high school classrooms to encourage students' awareness and interest in world affairs. And we bring Great Decision program produced by the Foreign Policy Association to our membership. Guests who are listening tonight or recorded later on, who may be inclined to support our programming and scholarship efforts, can join or donate on our website, www.savannahcwa.org. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Günther Jikeli from the University of Indiana, who will present Contemporary Anti-Semitism in Europe, an important topic which we hope will stimulate thoughtful discourse among viewers. Dr. Jikeli will be introduced by my fellow director, Jim Van Epps, in a moment. First, though, let me reiterate our thanks for the outstanding support that we are given all year by our platinum sponsor, Kreitz Auto Group, who sell and service BMW, Mercedes, Buick, GMC, and Sprinter vans. We also very much appreciate tonight's program sponsor, Audiology and Hearing Aid Services, better known as Haas, whose doctors of audiology are available in 3 locations in coastal Georgia. And now I'm going to introduce you to our moderator for tonight's program, our very own Jim Van Epps, who will introduce the speaker and moderate your questions. Jim?
Great, thank you, Chip. We are in for an interesting presentation by Dr. Jikeli, who is, one of Chip's previous slides indicates, is a historian and sociologist of modern Europe with particular interest in the history of anti-Semitism and in critical anti-Semitism studies, again, with Indiana University. Before Gunther came to the United States, he has held positions in academia and diplomacy in France, Germany, Israel, and Poland, and he's lectured widely at several universities, including, and I'd like to name a few, Yale, McGill in Canada, the Sorbonne and Sciences Po in Paris, Oxford and Trinity College in Dublin, Lisbon University, Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, and organizations such as UNESCO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the French National Library, the Salzburg Initiative, and the Museum of the Jewish People in Israel. Dr. Jikeli was listed on the Allgemeiner's list of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in 2019. Very impressive. His latest book, co-authored and entitled The New Unease, Antisemitism in Germany Today was published in German in 2019. And in 2015, he published European Muslim Antisemitism with the Indiana University Press, and co-authored Perceptions of the Holocaust in Europe and Muslim Communities in 2013. He's a research fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research. And in 2013, he was awarded the Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies by the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation and Tel Aviv University. Superb. His topic, anti-Semitism, often considered one of history's oldest hatreds, is making deadlines across the globe. A 2018 study by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights found that 39% of Jews in Europe indicated they had personally experienced anti-Semitic harassment. And in the United States, the number of anti-Semitic incidents and level of violence have also risen sharply in recent years. Furthermore, anti-Semitism seems to have entered the mainstream, crossing all political affiliations, nationalities, religions. Anti-Semitic ideas are drifting into the mainstream from the extremes of both the political right and left, as well as Islamists. Where is this coming from, and how can it be stopped? That's what we'll hear tonight. Now, following this presentation, Dr. Jikeli will take questions from our viewers that can easily be sent via the Zoom Q&A function on your computer or your iPad. Just click on the Q&A icon on your screen. A box will appear in which your question can be typed. Click on the box's send button. It's that easy. And I suggest you send your questions as they come to you quickly, as we will field them here. And the earlier we receive them, the better chance your question will have of being asked. Now, something a little different this evening. We will continue our question and answer session until 8:15, but please don't wait. Now, it's my honor to present Dr. Jikeli, and it is a great honor for us that you could join us this evening in this venue. Dr. Jikeli.
And thanks to the Wunderbar Together, the World Affairs Council of America and Savannah Council on World Affairs. So deeply thankful to all of you to make this happen. I would have loved to be in Savannah. I've never been, but I will come one day, and I hope soon that I can meet you in person and see how Savannah is like. I only heard good things about Savannah. Let me share some slides with you that might make it easier to follow what I want to say. I will give you a broad overview of developments that I see in Europe. As you know, that anti-Semitism, when I started out working on anti-Semitism good 15 years ago, it was already worrisome for many, but it was not so much in the public eye that we see it now. Only a couple of days ago, a new survey came out by the American Jewish Committee that showed that even in the United States now, Jews are deeply worried about the rise of anti-Semitism, but also the general population. Many of them are worried about the developments. So the numbers I have here in front of me, if the general public, 19% of Americans think that this is a serious problem, and a further 43% think that somewhat of a problem. So this is now recognized as a problem, and I think rightly so. So let me go ahead and share these slides. I hope you can all see that. So when we talk about Europe and anti-Semitism in Europe and Jewish communities in Europe, I want to stress that we have now in many parts of Europe, we have diverse Jewish communities, vibrant Jewish communities. Here you see some pictures from Berlin and London and Paris. And that is something that many wouldn't have thought that's going to be possible after the Shoah, after the Second World War, when so many Jews were murdered and entire communities were were killed in the Holocaust. But we have now a situation that, yes, there are Jewish communities that are diverse in these countries in Europe, not to the same level, of course, as before the Second World War, but it's not the 1920s, luckily. So we have very concerning signs of a rise of anti-Semitism, but so far Jews are not discriminated against by state authorities. But even if that is the case, we have also seen that there is increasingly, it's necessary to protect Jewish communities and to protect them often around the clock. So we have that's for decades in Germany the case, and increasingly so as the recent terror attacks in Halle have shown that was not enough protection. But we have now most Jewish institutions, synagogues, kindergartens, everything. We have police protection in Germany and also in France. In France, even more so. We have, after the terrorist attacks in 2015, heavily armed soldiers in front of even kindergartens, even inside kindergartens. I've been in Paris in Jewish institutions where they have also a little kindergarten, and the soldiers sit with the children there to protect them, which unfortunately is a necessary means of protection. What you see in London, they are more reserved with that. Maybe that is the British way. You don't see the protection as much, but it's likewise very much protected. And the Community Security Trust in Britain, they do a fantastic job. By the way, they are into advising even American communities now how to improve their security. So that unfortunately is necessary. And here you see a picture of the synagogue in Halle, where last year on Yom Kippur, a terrorist went out, a neo-Nazi went out to kill as many Jews as possible, as he stated. Luckily, we have also in the population people who, of course, condemn that and went down there in the population who were shocked at what you see here in the picture. But it's only this door that prevented a really massacre on a larger scale, so the terrorists couldn't get in. The terrorists couldn't get in, but he was determined, and he made out a plan that he published on social media before doing that. So he published his objectives, saying that he wants, as you can see here in point number 3, kill as many anti-whites as possible, Jews preferred. And he was influenced by white supremacist ideology, inspired by video gaming. So that is a new development that we see here. And what's also new is he, as a neo-Nazi, German neo-Nazi, wrote this in English and even spoke in English in his videos that he also put up. In his plan, interestingly, he referred to many of these white supremacist, white nationalist conspiracy theories. He thought of the current government in Germany as Zionist occupied government, which he says the Zionist occupied government for him are the Jews. Then he said something about the idea that Jews would be responsible for bringing in immigrants. That is something also known as the Great Replacement theory, also very prominent among American white nationalists. The terrorist in Pittsburgh was also his logic, why he thought that it was right to kill Jews if he wanted to go against immigration. And what I found striking, so a couple of days later, the terrorist's mother was interviewed, and she was asked, what does your son have against Jews? And her response was, I quote, he has the wrong vocabulary. He has nothing against Jews in that sense. He has something against the people who are behind the financial power. Who has not? So that shows the anti-Semitic thinking that his mother had. We don't know if he got this from his mother, but this is something that relates to many people in Germany, this kind of idea, and not only in Germany, and across Europe, and to a lesser extent also in the United States, that people think that Jews have too much power in international financial markets, for example. So 24% agree with that, according to a survey from 2019. And something else that I found striking is that many think that Jews still talk too much about what happened to them during the Holocaust. And that brings me to the populist AfD Alternative for Germany, that is a recent populist right-wing party that had some successes in the last general elections, got about 13% of the votes. And one of the main themes is a revisionist idea about the Holocaust, about the Second World War, saying, for example, one of the leaders that is often quoted, he said, I quote, Hitler and the Nazis are just a speck of bullshit in over 1,000 years of successful German history. So kind of belittling the Holocaust. And some of their leaders call directly for a reversal of the culture of remembrance, the Holocaust. So Björn Höcke is quoted saying as he wants a 180-degree reversal on the politics of remembrance of the Holocaust. He said, Germans are the only people in the world that have planted a monument of shame in the heart of their capital, referring to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. So this is a populist party that draws on some of these thinking that is eventually, I think, also a threat not only to Jews but also to democracy. So if we look at further trends in anti-Semitism in Europe, and that is to some extent also true in the US, we see that anti-Semitic acts are on the rise. So the numbers go up. That depends a little bit on the year. I will show you some graphs that show that, but also they're becoming more and more violent. So the level of violence that the perpetrators use is increasing. And that, of course, leads to an increasing unease among Jewish communities who only a decade ago did not have this feeling that they were under constant threat and that they would have to watch where they're going, when they're going, what they're wearing, if they identified as Jewish or not. So more and more protective measures are necessary. What we also see that the anti-Semitic discourse is going from the margins, from the extreme political right and left, and also Islamists, drifting into mainstream and in some mainstream newspapers, but of course very often on social media. We see something that is a positive development, that hatred against Jews is condemned forcefully very often by politicians, but often in principle and not directly, and often not if it comes from the own political wing, if you want, or if it comes from minorities. We see that online anti-Semitism is now by far the tool that is used mostly for anti-Semitic propaganda, and it's very difficult to do something about it. There are attempts, and some of them successful. I can talk about this more in depth if you're interested in that. And then also a good thing is that the anti-Semites of today, they don't have like something that unites them so far. So the political right and political left, they have only sometimes an overlap, and also with Islamists. And some of these overlaps is this anti-Zionist that often they can agree on. But what we see that in Europe, this violence that we've seen, that many Jews have been murdered in the first 2 decades of this century just for being Jewish, and a total of since the year 2000, total of 33 people, mostly in France, a total of 33 that is in the US and Europe, but mostly in Europe, have been murdered for being Jewish. And the perpetrators are mostly jihadists in Europe, white supremacists in the United States, and we also had last year some black supremacists from the Black Hebrew Israelites. But what is often even more worrisome for Jewish communities in Europe is not the extreme violence, but also the everyday anti-Semitism that comes from neighbors or co-workers. So that is even more difficult to, or often more even very shocking if you have that in your everyday experience. So the numbers have gone up, as I said. It's often not as clear because there are variations from year to year, but certainly they have gone up since the year 2000. So we have, in most countries, we do not have good statistics. Where there are 2 countries in Europe with excellent statistics, that's France and Great Britain, and Germany is only building up now capacities to register anti-Semitic incidents systematically. So here you see a graph from France. There you see this clear spike since the year 2000. And what you see in red is also these are violent acts. So they are, the proportion of violent acts is much higher since the year 2000 than in the 1990s. But you see the variations over the years, but it has never gone down back to the level of the 1990s. And in the numbers for the United Kingdom, you see a steady increase, more or less steady increase, with a record number last year of 1,800 anti-Semitic incidents. And there you also see a rise of the physical anti-Semitic incidents. For the United States, it is a little bit later by comparison, and then there is a debate on where you think that the rise happens. Was it around the year 2013, 14, or was it after the last elections in 2016? Definitely it's higher now than in the year 2013. But back to Europe. So as Jim already mentioned, we have some surveys, and this is only one of several surveys in Europe that asked Jews about their experiences, personal experiences of anti-Semitism. And there we see really high numbers that almost 40% say they personally experienced anti-Semitic harassment, and a further 7% anti-Semitic violence and vandalism. And what is also shocking, and there is really room for improvement, and I think authorities are working on this together with Jewish communities, that only 25% of the anti-Semitic incidents are reported to any organization, to authorities, or even to Jewish organizations. So most of the anti-Semitic incidents, they go unreported. And that is also true in the United States, by the way. And these are some figures. So what you see in yellow was just published 2 days ago, that even in the United States, there is a really high number of Jews who have personally experienced some form of anti-Semitism. And again, 75% do not report the incident to any authority. So that leaves us to a situation that many Jews hide their identity, but it depends also on a number of factors if you're targeted of anti-Semitism. So if you are, we speak these days often of risk groups. So this is another, it's not a COVID risk group, but it's a risk group for being targeted by anti-Semites. And that is if you're visibly Jewish, if you're male, and if you're young, you're more likely to become victim of anti-Semitism. And as I said, this leads to a situation where many Jews hide their identity in public, which is, I think, concerning in itself. So on average, in the European Union, 71% avoid wearing symbols of Judaism in public. Some of them all the time, some of them frequently, and some only occasionally. But so they do that not to be identified as Jewish. And in the US, it's the numbers are much better, but still, more than 30% also avoid wearing symbols of Judaism. So who are the perpetrators then? So that is a tricky question, and it's often not a question that many people like to talk about, because then you have to talk about, okay, who are the anti-Semites? And maybe we should, if we identify certain groups and certain organizations even, then we should do something about it. And it's only recently that politicians are going into that. But so if we ask the victims of anti-Semitism who they think the perpetrators are, there were these surveys that you can see. So in the European Union, mostly they are unidentified, the perpetrators. That's what the Jewish victims said. But then the largest groups across the countries are Muslim extremists. And the second largest groups are, that it was surprising to me, not from the political right, but from the political left. And then thirdly, from the political right. And fourthly, from Christian extremists. But you see that depends also on the country. So whereas in Poland, you have a lot of anti-Semitism coming from Christian extremists, you have in the UK, France, and Germany almost none coming from Christian extremists, but the number of Muslim perpetrators is much higher, and also from the political left. So that are these surveys, but what are the ideological sources? So mainly three. There are some others, but these are the main or most powerful sources of anti-Semitism where people get excited. So one is the anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist from the political left, usually that accuses Israel as being the worst imperialist, the most racist country, the most colonizing state. Often in Europe, this is seen as, so the accusation goes then against Israel and also the United States. So anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism often go hand in hand. And then we have a third stream influence from Islamism. This is has been a problem that has been ignored for many decades. We see now, you probably have watched the news in the last days, that France announced at least that they want to crack down on Islamist organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood. So in the worldview of these Islamists, which of course there is a big distinction between Islamists and Muslims, and Islam and Islamism is really not the same. But in this political Islam, there is this idea that Jews have always been at war against the Muslims, and that the Muslims should defend themselves against the Jews, and the jihadist thinks that this should be done with violent means. And then we have, of course, the white nationalists, and here's the accusations that Jews undermine the nation, and that is an old trope that the Nazis, of course, developed very much. And we have these great replacement fantasies. That's a bit new. And these three, mostly radical, mostly on the margins, ideological sources, we see now that they seep somehow into more mainstream way of thinking. So we see that in these anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist movements, we see that that has seeped into some of what we in this country here call progressive movements, when people only talk about oppressor people and oppressed people, and make this very dualistic theory about the world. And this goes back to teachings of Mao and Che Guevara, who made this distinction of the oppressor and oppressed people instead of the class theory. So that has often like a Marxist idea to it, that was then changed to this oppressor and oppressed dualistic idea. Then we see that in Islamism, this accusation of the Jews that are at war against the Muslims, we see that in many of the Muslim organizations in France, in Germany, and in Britain, that those who have the most funding, they often comes from abroad, that these are Islamist organizations with their own literature and their own education material. So that seeps into education as well. That doesn't mean, of course, that all mosques are by far not Islamist, but many Islamist groups are strong among the groups, the Muslim organizations in France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Britain, and so forth. And we have also something that with the populist movements, white nationalism, that also seeps into more mainstream way of thinking. And as we have seen in the case of Germany, that the AfD is gaining in popularity. Right. So to what you see then there is that the loudest voices are often then these extremists, and we have this kind of demonization then of Jews and of Israel in many parts. And I want to say a few words also about the online anti-Semitism that has really become the most powerful tool of anti-Semites. It connects anti-Semites and potential anti-Semites of all sorts, right? And there's an exchange of ideas, and it easily transfers to between different social media platforms. Even if now the bigger platforms like Facebook and Twitter try to crack down on some of the worst disseminators of anti-Semitic propaganda, like Holocaust deniers. That is what Facebook and Twitter have announced they want to ban. But our research here, we have a major research project on Twitter, and we see that there is still a lot of Holocaust denial on Twitter even after this announcement. And also the social media platforms, they allow a radicalization of anti-Semites. So what we've seen in these terrorist attacks in this country and in Germany, and we take the example of Halle or in France, jihadists, doesn't matter if jihadists or white supremacists, they watch the videos that they see from other terrorists and they're inspired by this. So when I went on the social media platform Gap after the terrorist attacks in Pittsburgh, excuse me, where the terrorists shot 11 Jews who were praying in a synagogue. So on this platform where this terrorist was active, I went to see the discussion. And the discussion was among like-minded. Some were endorsing that, praising the terrorist, and others were condemning the terrorist, but condemning the terrorist is saying he just killed elderly Jews, so that was not effective. So these kind of very, very radicalized ideas, they can thrive in these niches of the internet, right? And then you have a constant, I would almost call it bombardment of like anti-Semitic ideas. There was a few years ago, only 3 years ago, that said like every 83 seconds there is an anti-Semitic post on the internet. There was a study, I think, by the World Jewish Congress done in 2017. And our research now from this year shows it's rather only on Twitter and only on certain subjects every 2 seconds. So there is really a massive propaganda of anti-Semitism that we see. And to come to sum this up, if we talk about today's anti-Semitism in a context, so we see, yes, we have all these threats against the Jewish communities, but we have also vibrant Jewish communities in the diaspora. We had a lot of discussion about will they stay in Europe or will they leave Europe, and there was a wave of immigration from France to Israel in the year 2015-16. But most Jews in these countries, in France, in Britain, in Germany, they feel British, German, French, and that's their country and they want to stay there. And they work with the authorities to make it possible that these Jewish communities will there also be in the future. So in general, many politicians have understood now in Europe that this is an important issue, not only for the Jewish communities in their countries and their citizens, but also for their understanding of themselves, of the promise that they their societies did after the Second World War, saying we want to be democracies that minorities can thrive, including Jewish communities, of course. And if it's not possible that the Jewish communities are protected, that is a kind of a bankruptcy for these societies. So that's why one of the reasons that we see now in Germany, for example, that we see many activities from the government and from inside the lenders and communities that try to put this on the agenda and try to see where the anti-Semitism is coming from and to do something about it. What we see also that with the distance past now of the Holocaust, that this is a topic that apparently seems to be weighing in the conscience of many, that we have a lot of comparisons to the Holocaust that can be seen as diminishing the Holocaust, or even inversion of the Holocaust, so that Israel is now accused of being like the Nazis or so. So this is a development that should need to be watched. But one thing, of course, is a big difference from the 1920s, that we now have the state of Israel that can act, and that is a safe haven for Jews. So that is, of course, different from the 1920s, 1930s. In the manifestations of anti-Semitism that we see today, we have this violence from the margins, right? And that is condemned usually. So the violence from jihadists and white supremacists, often inspired, by the way. So that's a thing that has changed. It's not organized groups. They are also there. But the most extreme violence is often by individuals who are often self-radicalized. Right? We see these anti-Semitic ideas that that these terrorists then have. We see that also in some of these ideas, at least in milder forms, maybe in the mainstream. And it's a discussion if that is drifting, if these ideas are drifting from the margins, the extremes, into the mainstream, or if it is in the mainstream and it's only acted out more extremely in the margins. What we see, what I find very worrisome for in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of also for democracies, is the rise of conspiracy theories that are very often then anti-Semitic, mostly anti-Semitic. So we have the traditional ones about the Illuminati and the Freemasons, and increasingly like seeing Zionists and Jews behind everything, including COVID. That is a prominent threat also online, but also offline in some of these rallies, protest rallies against the lockdown, for example. We see again that the online anti-Semitism is really the tool that needs to be addressed if we talk about combating anti-Semitism. And again, one positive thing is that these anti-Semites have not yet united again behind something, a common political theme, but they are building this up, and this looks like they're building this up in making propaganda against Israel or against Zionism. Of course, when anti-Semites talk about Zionism, then they talk about something entirely different than what I think of Zionism. So if I think of Zionism, that's the idea that there should be a Jewish state. If anti-Semites think of Zionism, then they think about conspiracy theories, how the Zionists would control certain governments and have lobbies and so forth. So that is and has led now to increasingly action also in some of the administration of the European Union. For example, there is now a working group on anti-Semitism by the European Commission. In fact, there is next month they invited me to a major conference there that they want to see what kind of strategies have worked to fight and combat anti-Semitism in different countries. But it's a question if the measures that the countries are taking, if they are enough, if they're honest enough to combat really the anti-Semitism and put something forceful against this rise of anti-Semitism. But of course, there are two main fields of action that are needed. One is that a signal to those who act on their anti-Semitic beliefs that they will face consequences for these actions, and there will be no excuse, which is sometimes in the past has not happened. So in Germany, there's a famous case where people put fire to a synagogue, and then they said this was because they wanted to make a political statement about Israel, and they were not persecuted for hate crimes, what I think they should have. So these kind of signals that you kind of get away with these kind of arguments, with anti-Semitic arguments, that needs to stop. So it should be forceful signals to anti-Semites that they will face consequences. And of course, education is a major tool. So if we look at education in the educational systems in the European countries, there is a lot of room for improvement in how children are taught about the Jewish history in their country, Jewish communities, about Israel, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is often very one-sided, the teaching about this.
Not another one.
And I want to stop here now, and maybe we can then have time for the questions. Thank you so much for your patience and for watching this this PowerPoint presentation. I hope that you could see it. I had some trouble in between.
We could, Dr. Jikeli, thank you for an excellent, ever timely and interesting presentation. And now it is time to get to the questions. What I'd like to make two remarks relative to that. Again, while the formal program will end a couple minutes after 8, you and I will stay on to try and answer questions till about 8:15. Secondly, of some of the questions that have come in, one of the phenomena of doing this virtual is that questions come in during your presentation that you might have addressed later on. So I will try to phrase them so they're not, just so they're appropriate, and if you would fill in the blanks, so to speak. First question comes in from Roger Erna. And Roger asks, which you just touched on a couple seconds ago, please discuss anti-Semitism and its relationship to anti-Zionism.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, these are two words, of course, so it's not the same. And there's a long history also of anti-Zionism in Jewish communities also. And so when Herzl and also others had this idea that there should be Jewish states, most Jews, in fact, in Europe did not agree with that. So they thought, oh, we should try to stay in France or in Germany, or so that is, of course, shows us that not every anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. The distinction then, what we see today, I think, is only in theory complicated. Often in practice, it's very straightforward. So it's something like if somebody insults you, or there's a defamation, that's a different kind of thing than criticism. So in the case of Israel, if you say, okay, this policy is really a bad policy, I disagree with that. And even if you are harsh in your language, well, that's still criticism. If you say Israel should not exist, or Israel is an evil state, or Israel is controlling the world, is hypnotizing the world, well, this is a kind of anti-Semitic thinking. So in practice, very often it's not so complicated to make this distinction. And useful, I think, is this IRA definition that is often now quoted, and we use that in our research. But even in this definition, it says, well, you have to look at the context. But this definition gives you examples. So it gives you examples saying, well, if you deny the Jewish people the right of self-determination, if you say that there should be no Israel, Israel should be abandoned, abolished, well, then it's a pretty good sign indication that this is anti-Semitic. But even if that's not anti-Semitic, if that is something that people demand, that aside, and if you want, if you argue for the dissolution of a country that is under threat by its neighbors, and if you say that this should cease to exist, I mean, imagine what would happen if the Israeli army, if the IDF would, from one day of another, would say, we all go home, we don't use our weapons, then it's very likely that there would be a massacre against the now citizens of Israel, including the Arab Muslim citizens, probably. So this is a very dangerous idea. What is seen then as anti-Zionism, but as what I said, the anti-Zionists, who often these self-declared anti-Zionists, they think of Zionism as something very different than what I think of Zionism. It's often a conspiracy theory that they have with that, and that comes if you say, well, Israel is hypnotizing the world. Well, this is something that has this conspiracy theory with that already. But thanks for the question.
Second question, one that's delightful for us, is from Barbara Ruddy, who said, you have excellent speakers. And thank you, Barbara. We appreciate that very much. And you're certainly seeing one of them, Professor Jikeli, with us this evening. The next question is from Alan Barnes. Excuse me. Has the influx from North Africa, most of whom are Muslims, has it had an effect on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe?
Yeah, definitely. So this is something that in 2015, about 1 million, 2014, 15, 16, about 1.5 million people came as refugees to Germany, and then also to other countries like Sweden and Austria. They took also many refugees. And many of these refugees, not all of them, by far not all of them, but were from countries, not only North Africa, but mostly Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq, where anti-Semitism is in the educational system. So if we look at the school books in Syria, they praise, even today, Hitler. So Hitler is in the school books in Syria seen or portrayed as a strong man who defended the Germans against the Jews. So that is what I have seen in studies. And I went out with 3 colleagues, and we interviewed 150 Syrians in Germany to ask them about their ideas, including about Jews, including about Israel and the Holocaust. So it was very interesting, I have to say. We are now in the 3rd phase that will start next month with these refugees 5 years after they've been in Germany and exposed to other ideas. So one thing that we found is, unsurprisingly, many had this conspiratorial way of thinking against Jews and Israel. But we also found many who said they were shocked when they learned about the history, what they couldn't learn in their country about the Holocaust or about meeting Jewish community members in Germany then, and they thought differently about it. Also, many experienced, or some at least, in Israel that I remember vividly how, particularly one interviewee I have in mind said, look, Israel, I don't like Israel particularly, but what I was taught in school and in the propaganda by our regime, how bad Israel was, and what the reality then was, how our regime would bombard us it was even worse than the propaganda that they put out against Israel. And some are, of course, fleeing also from ISIS, saying they're even worse than our regime. So they were rethinking. Then they had stories of some of the people who were injured on the border towards Israel. They were treated in Israel. So they were treated in Israeli hospitals, and they were hearing these stories. So we see that also now in the Arab world. There's a rethinking about this. We see that in the Abraham Accords, that there is some rethinking in some countries, at least, among some people. But yes, so a number of these anti-Semitic incidents in Germany and also in other countries. Some of the perpetrators, they came as refugees in 2015-16. That is true.
Next question. Received this from two different sources. One is from Tom in a separate communication with us, and also from Alan Barnes. An opinion piece in Monday's Savannah Morning News referred briefly to replacement theory. You've also mentioned replacement theory. Can you explain a little more in a little more detail, as well as its impact in this country?
Right. Yeah. So replacement theory is basically, white nationalists, they have this idea that the white race is superior and should have the power in the society they are in. And some want to have like a separate country, but the idea is that white people are superior. But their experience is, well, first of all, they're also, we live in more and more diverse societies. Migration, that's just a part of our time, and was also in history, of course. But so they see that there is migration, but then also they see, well, the white people are not so superior. If they were so superior, how would you explain that now also other communities thrive? You have like successful businessmen or intellectuals who are not white. And how do you explain that? So they have a problem, if you want. And they have a problem how to explain this, and how to and to find somebody who's responsible for that. So this is an old idea, but it's now refreshed, saying, well, of course, the Jews are responsible to bring all the immigrants. They are organizing that. They're organizing that in some ways of like putting pressure on the government to have a more friendly policy towards immigrants. Or one theme that is often used is George Soros, this funder donor who gives a lot of money to like progressive organizations. That's true, but he's definitely doesn't have the power to define what the American immigration policy is, or what the in European countries is. But that's the idea. So saying, well, we don't like that there are more and more immigrants, and because of this worldview, the immigrants they are not as worse, maybe, or they are less worse than the white race. That's their thinking. So they cannot really be responsible for that. That has to be run by somebody else. So that is then the Jews, who are seen as powerful, and then are attacked in this thinking. So that's the reasoning why then people like Bowers, like this terrorist in Pittsburgh, they think this is the right way to fight immigration, by killing Jews in the synagogue, the same way the terrorists in Halle. That is the great replacement theory. And these terrorists act out violently against this, but you also have many people on the internet who just disseminate this theory and don't act on that. Mm-hmm.
Let me say at this point, it's thank you. And this has been an excellent session. I'd like to thank you for your presentation, as well as your insights during the question and answers. I would say that I would let you know that we've got about a half dozen other questions we'd like to get to. But for those who can't stay with us for whatever reason, I understand you will. Let me turn this back over to Chip O'Brien, and then he'll give it back to us to handle some other really interesting questions that we have. So Chip, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. And on behalf of our directors, our board of directors, our co-hosts, our sponsors and members, guests, let me also add my thanks to Dr. Gunther Jikeli for this stimulating presentation, as well as the engaging questions from the viewing audience, some of which we're going to hear more about in a few minutes. I'd like to share one last slide with you before we go back to those questions. This is a slide to tell you about our next program, which is on December 3rd, when retired Air Force Major General Robert Latif will explain how we are preparing for the new global battlefield. Go to our website for all the details for that presentation. It should be very interesting. Until then, please stay well. Good night from Savannah, and thanks again for listening. And as we said before, for those of you who wish to stay online, Dr. Jikeli has kindly agreed to respond to some more of the remaining unanswered questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jim to moderate the rest of them. And again, thanks for everybody for listening.
Great, thanks, Chip. So Dr. Jikeli, let me get to Phil Rosen's question. You stated that anti-Semitism is not state-sponsored, he says. That's not the case in Poland and Hungary, and to a lesser extent in Lithuania and Slovenia. Note the recent court decision in Slovenia. Could you comment on Phil's question and comment, please?
Yes, I saw this comment and I checked. Unfortunately, if I see that correctly, Phil Rosen has left already, but I agree with Phil Rosen. So that's why I said mostly not state-sponsored. But it's interesting to watch. So even Hungary and even Poland, officially they say they're against anti-Semitism and they have programs against anti-Semitism that they do. But they in Poland just very recently they have this law now that makes it almost impossible to produce kosher food or meat in Poland, which also the farmers are upset about because they were one of the main exporters of kosher meat to the European market. So that is a big that is correct. That is especially on this the slaughtering practice. There is some state-sponsored anti-Semitism. I would agree to that, and also in some other areas. So we see that increasingly, unfortunately. Another thing is even the circumcision. This is not a theme here in the United States because many Jews, non-Jews are circumcised, but in Europe, this has also been debated, and there were even attempts to ban circumcision. And that, of course, would also make it very difficult for Jewish communities. So
Sure.
Yes, there are some of these, what you could say, this is state-sponsored anti-Semitism. I would agree in some parts, yeah.
Yeah, good, thank you. D. Rubin, and I don't have the first name, but the question is, on US campuses, many Jewish students are claiming and feeling harassment, mostly from the left, progressive student bodies, and faculty. Is this happening in European universities as well?
Not to that extent. So we see that in Britain, but we don't see it so much in other countries. Well, it depends. It's also partly because if we look at Spain, for example, I remember we once tried to do an academic conference at a university in Madrid in Spain. And so that was an international conference. And we wanted to like publicize this conference with one of the co-sponsors, and they said, please do not publish the address where we're going to hold this conference. So they were trying to, they were really worried about security just by talking about anti-Semitism. So then I realized that that's really something that even on campuses in Spain, well, there is a strong enough movement that that is mostly anti-Zionist, that doesn't want to talk about anti-Semitism, and also makes it then difficult for Jewish students. But we don't have many Jewish students then. That's maybe also a difference to the United States. But it's this movement that we see here, the BDS movement, for example, is strong in the United Kingdom, not so much in Germany. It's on the universities, it's not to the same level. But even if you look on the campuses in the United States, this is an increasing problem. But also many campuses, like our campus, doesn't have a strong BDS movement. So it depends on the campus. If you look on the East Coast here, that's West Coast. So in California, there you have a strong BDS movement here.
Yeah.
So I would say it's difficult to compare this, but I see this more here and in the United Kingdom than in other places in Europe.
So we're running out of time, but not running out of questions. So let me get to a couple of them quickly. Dan Malachuk asks, university students in Illinois have compelled divestment in companies that do business in Israel. How widespread is this phenomenon?
To call for a boycott?
Or yes, boycott, divesting, even
Right.
divesting of investments.
Yeah. This is in this country, you see more and more student groups push for it. Often that is driven by a small minority, a small minority of activists. They push for it, and then they get the student body to pass a resolution. And the aim often is not really this investment, because the university, they don't do it, or the companies. This is actually the boycott thing is not working in an economic sense. But what is working is that this demonizes Israel, because when you make this argument, then these organizations then make the point that Israel is so evil that it should be boycotted. And that often includes not only like a boycott of the investment, but also bringing speakers from Israel and so on. So this kind of behavior is in many countries, it's illegal. In France, for example, because this is then like racist discrimination. You could make the case, but this is often even something that these organizations want, because it just brings them more publicity, and then they can say, we cannot express freely our wish to boycott.
Yeah. Let me make the last question, Dr. Jikeli. What are some successful strategies? And you talked a little bit about this, but what are governments doing, or what are some successful strategies in used to combat anti-Semitism?
Right. Yes, I think. It is. As I said, if we want to, always have to be then specific. But in general, if you get enough people to disagree with often the minority of the anti-Semites, because often the anti-Semites, the activist anti-Semites, they are a small minority. They have the loudest voices, and they shout, and they go out there with the propaganda. But often they try to intimidate the silent majority who often does not agree with their hatred. So if you get it if you see campus setting, for example, we had this wonderful, I must say, wonderful experience here. There was a group on my campus that put out an anti-Semitic flyer for the event, and that was kind of co-sponsored with the Middle Eastern department. And I called the director of the Middle Eastern department and said, look, this is a student group, but you are also a co-sponsor, and that went over your newsletter. And he apologized and said, oh, I did not see that. And he apologized and made a forceful statement on his newsletter saying, this is not okay, I condemn this, and we don't want to work again with this student group. And so that, I think, had a very forceful effect. That this student group was much less active, much less visible, and also to all others on this newsletter, it was a signal saying, we do not accept that. This is not a discourse that we want to promote. So in small things, you can be really effective just to speak up against anti-Semitism. Often, most effective, of course, is that if you do it in your own circle. So this anti-Semitic flyer went over this newsletter from the Middle Eastern Studies Department, but then the director said, well, this was our fault and we condemn this. So it went over the same newsletter, that was much more effective than if I would from the outside say, I condemn this and this is bad. So if you do it in your own organization, but that is something, of course, that requires courage to do so if it's in the own organization. But
Sure.
This is the most effective thing.
To the viewers who have tuned in this evening, my apology for not being able to get everything in. To Dr. Jikeli, thank you so much for your presentation and what you've done on behalf of the Savannah Council of World Affairs. Terrific presentation, very thoughtful answer to our questions. We're appreciative of your contribution to our program. We can clearly understand why, having listened and watched you this evening, why you travel so much, you speak around the world, and why you're so engaged in other programs. Thank you so much for your participation this evening. We look forward to, we'll stay in touch, and we do hope to see you in Savannah again. And again, thank you everybody else for watching this evening.
And Jim, thank you and Dr. Jikeli for that bonus round of questions. They were great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Everybody.